Good afternoon. Thank you for being so courageous to stay here the whole day, to come listen to me when the sun is out like this. I heard it was the first couple of beautiful days. I'll try to be as brief and to the point as possible, so you might still enjoy a little bit at least. I'm going to talk. Let me first get this correct here so that it doesn't drop again. Never been the most handy guy in my family. If somebody needs to repair the window or anything like that, I always ask my wife. So I'm not sure if I'm going to get this on, but I'll give it a try. I'm going to talk about digital entrepreneurship in Europe. And actually, what I want to talk about is, I hope, something that kind of relates to you, and that is, as I was, if you're stuck in Europe, in some place that people might have heard of, but it doesn't really ring a bell, you know, whether it's Gdansk or the city where I'm from, Ghent. When you say, okay, I'm from there and I'm starting a company, you get this stare and people say, oh, well, that's very interesting. So what are you doing? But it's not the same thing as saying, well, you know, I'm doing this startup in San Francisco, or you know, I'm involved in the startup scene in Berlin or London, the new Silicon Alley, etc., etc. And the situation that most of us, the rest of Europe, so to speak, finds themselves in is that they are, in a lot of cases, in a smaller community, less known in the world, less venture capital, less exposure, and you still want to make a success of yourself, you still want to make a success of your company. I've been in that situation, and when I started, I'm an old guy, I'll come back to that later, you know, I can't even put these kind of things on. But when I was in that situation 25 years ago, I really believed ICT was a driving force of innovation in our society. Yeah? And it still is. That's one of the constants that I see. But to make that work and to make such an ecosystem actually work in your environment, in your society, you need a lot of preconditions. And this is a slide that I actually borrowed from a professor from Berkeley, Jerry Engel, who describes the ecosystem that is required to really have an innovation cluster, to get more than an individual, single company success, but really create a dynamics in a region or in a country that creates lasting conditions for success. You know, the kind of discussion the person from Berlin this morning was on about, so what makes Berlin what it is right now? There's a couple of preconditions. He talked about the money, for example, as well. All those elements are on there. And you cannot necessarily count on the fact that in every region in, like, let's say here, or in Flanders, where I'm from, that in every region in Europe, or in the States for that matter, you know, not whole of the States is Silicon Valley, far from it, those conditions are available. So the question then is, do we all move to Silicon Valley, or do some of us stay here and try to build businesses here, knowing that we'll have to connect to the rest of the world? And I want to share some of my thoughts on that process with you, based on my personal experience, but also based on what I've been currently doing for the last 7 years, is trying to create that kind of dynamic in the region that I'm from, Flanders in Belgium, where I returned to after a spell in the United States, where I worked as well. So this was me. Can you believe it? When I was 15 or 16 years old. And I was pre-digital native, as you can see. Yeah? This is my son, right? Ruben, who is now, he's now 17 years. He was actually younger than 15 on that picture. He still blames me for using this picture, but anyway, he doesn't read books anymore. I'm not sure if some of you already have kids, but it's pretty hard to get them to read books these days because they're digital natives and get all their info from the internet. And being an old guy, I will do two things: share a little bit of my experience, but also try to explain how we work with that generation of digital natives that my son belongs to, and that is actually right now also at universities, the researchers. This is where I started my career, in 1987. And this is actually the buildings of Siemens Corporation. Siemens was mentioned before in the Berlin context in Munich. I'm a Belgian, but I started my career actually at university in artificial intelligence, which was mentioned this morning as one of the trends of the future. So you see, it takes a while sometimes to get to some results. But I did my first work on artificial intelligence at the corporate research and development labs of Siemens. And that was a typical career for somebody my age now, 50. You know, when you got out of university, you went to go Siemens or to IBM or to work in, and you were interested in development or research. You went to their corporate labs, and that's where you potentially could have a career in the mindset of the 70s or the 80s of another 30 years growing up in the ladder. I didn't do that. I quit because I didn't like big companies quite quickly after 3 years. But I did do interesting research there. And the times of those corporate research labs are virtually over, right? Because a lot of things happened. This is, on the left-hand side, it's the first workstation that I worked on, an Apollo or a Sun workstation, first generation. At the same time, the Mac was introduced, and these guys and others changed the way we're looking at the high-tech industry. You know, the first wave of startups in the 80s and then in the 90s in our business, in the software business, really changed the way we look at the structure, and the corporate labs they're still important, but disruptive innovation, it became the norm that disruptive innovation didn't come out of Bell Labs or another big corporate research lab, but out of startups that were financed by VCs. And now, actually, the last 7 years, because I had 20 plus years of working actually in software companies, startups, I'll come back to that later. I've been working for an organization, iMinds, that actually wants to help create an ecosystem like that also in the region that I'm from, in Belgium, Flanders. And we do that by trying to attain enough critical mass, because I'll get back to that later, but if you want to have a successful cluster of innovation, you also need all those elements in place, like good universities, venture capitalists and business angels that are willing to finance you, smart entrepreneurs, repeat entrepreneurs, but you also need some critical mass. So we had separate universities working on this thing in Belgium. They were all fragmented. We brought them together. I'm not going to go into details, but I do believe that you need to set your ambition high enough that you get enough capability to execute and enough critical mass. And I have the impression, based on the discussions I had with people from here, that in actual fact here in Gdansk and the region, you have enough critical mass in ICT know-how to create the dynamics to build an ecosystem like that. But another number of other prerequisites will have to be in place as well. For example, you need to go global. If you look at our research community in our region, we've been very active in attracting talent from all over the world. Yeah? And Belgium is not Silicon Valley, far from it. So you have to work hard to convince people to come. The only way we cannot convince them with the nice weather, yeah, that's for sure. What we have to convince them with is the quality of the companies and the work they're going to be doing. And we've been quite successful in doing that. But I think it's crucial for every region that wants to, or every community that wants to do that, to be very open to the influx of know-how and of brains from the rest of the world. And of course there, Silicon Valley is the prime example. Yeah. Now, what has happened in research and development, incubation and venturing that is different from the corporate days when I started? This is another picture. We are part of the European Institute of Technology, the ICT labs, which is a community of labs across Europe that are clustered around Paris, London, Berlin, and also Eindhoven, which is across the border from where we are. Belgium and Holland are close to each other. And this is the campus in Eindhoven of the former Philips research campus. Philips had a huge campus with 10,000 or 15,000 people working there. And it's almost completely gone, right? But it has been replaced by a number of medium-sized companies and starters and incubators that form a community together with research centers like we are. And that kind of dynamic of interaction and creative destruction and creation is, I think, what we should be going for in the future. I'm going to skip some slides, but because of the time, I spent 20 minutes putting this thing on, so we'll have to look at the time. But I also think it is crucial to think of some sort of specialization, because you can't do everything, right? And ICT is a very broad field. For example, if you look at the Berlin scene, it's primarily about business to consumer, I think, and about internet. What we're trying to focus our companies on, also because of the smaller community we're in, the smaller market, as compared to Russia, for example, the smaller take-up you can have of certain more platforms. We try to focus more on business to business and on particular verticals. I think that's one thing. As a starter, you also have to think about what context I'm in and what am I going to focus on, given my ecosystem. Are there a lot of companies here that I can sell to? Have I got a large consumer potential, etc.? And then, last but not least, we put almost everything, I think, of our efforts into incubation and venturing. When I started my current job, and I was given the task of building this company, or this, it's a private-public partnership to support companies and starters. The first focus was on supporting existing companies who were already growing and are trying to, or already established. But I quickly, because of my own personal beliefs, switched a lot of our resources to help starters. Because the disruptive innovation clearly in our market comes from that part of our ICT sector. And that's why we've been focusing most of our efforts in our region on incubation and entrepreneurship right now. Yeah? We don't have a cost advantage. The only thing we have is brains and a very open economy, so to speak. And there's a couple of elements there that I want to go into a little bit more detail. And they're based on my own experiences as a person who was involved in the number of startups prior to taking this job. When I left Siemens Corporation, I joined a Canadian startup. They were based out of Toronto, and I joined the founders team virtually. We were somewhat less than a dozen, and I was the first guy in Europe, so to speak. Now, this startup was a very good company, in my opinion, technology-wise, with a good team, and they had quite quickly, like most Canadian companies do, they moved into the US market, and their base was the US. The biggest offices were in the US. They then came to Europe, and they grew quite nicely, but after 5 to 6 years working with that company, I noticed that the founder actually didn't want to go public. He really wanted to keep the company at a certain size, keep it manageable, and ultimately he sold it himself, reaped quite to eventually Oracle, but reaped quite nice rewards. But what wasn't part of that company's culture was the Silicon Valley ethos that was mentioned this morning, this morning I think, about sharing in the rewards. There were no option schemes. People were not incentivized to give, to be part of the company also as an owner. So at some point in time, I was then almost 30, I drew my conclusions and I said, I'm going to start my own thing. I think I discovered an academic spin-off of a university in Ghent, in Belgium, that was better. It was actually from another university, Louvain. And I started there as a business developer. And there I learned the hard lesson that not every startup is a success. After 2 years, we basically went under because although we had a superior product, still think we did. We eventually, SAP, the big German company, bought the intellectual property. We basically didn't have enough capital to win in the marketplace. We couldn't develop proper sales, etc., etc. So we went under. And from that experience, I learned the importance of having the proper, financial stability. I agree with what speaker said this morning of you don't need as much cash in the beginning as you used to do these days because of a number of factors. But definitely, if you want to compete globally, at some point in time, you need to be relatively well-funded to actually do the proper sales and marketing. So at that point in time, I actually went to another company in 1998, so we're talking ancient history here. It actually was earlier than that. It was 2000. It doesn't matter. 94, I think. 94, I joined them, but I moved to Dallas in 98. There I went to a company that did the whole thing. We got options in the company. We did the IPO, and I saw the good dynamic that you could create in a company. But also, at some point in time, the bubble burst, and although we were a very good company, we also got a serious hit from the crash of the internet, although we were not vaporware. I saw the whole cycle of the virtuous cycle of how the Silicon Valley system can work. And I think we need to really keep in mind, if you set up companies, do it properly. It was very insightful to see how Blackbox, for example, what the prescriptions are of how to put a team together, etc., etc. Well, I went through all the negative and positive examples. And myself, and what I see in the starters that we coach in Belgium is that a lot of people make the same mistakes all over again. And that's normal, but it helps if somebody can tell you, watch out for this or that. Something I didn't have, but that I hope people that start now do have. And just to go back to that previous slide, I think the culture that you see this happening here, but you see it across Europe. The culture, the entrepreneurial culture that is so prevalent in Silicon Valley is taking root like The Economist wants it to be, but I think it is actually taking root in lots of parts of Europe. And we will need it. Now, one thing I want to warn you for, I work for an organization that also partially gets government funding, is don't count on government. This is a book you should read, not necessarily the entrepreneurs themselves, but people who are trying to support them. It's called Boulevard of Broken Dreams by a Harvard professor. And it's about all the public efforts that wasted money on building nice buildings, incubators, but didn't get any entrepreneurs to really move in there or emerge from that. Yeah? All kinds of flawed financial schemes as well. So you have to be very careful what you do to support and create such an ecosystem from a government perspective. We developed a whole range of instruments, and I'm not going to go into that now in detail because it would take me too long, given the time. But we really believe it's important that we coach and support people, but we let them be in the driver's seat. And we don't give money for free. They get equity investments or convertible loans. They don't get subsidies to get going, because those can have the perverse effect that you start focusing on getting subsidies as opposed to start focusing on your customer and the value you can deliver to him. But it all begins, in my opinion, with student entrepreneurship. If you go to Berkeley or to Stanford and those kind of universities, it's ingrained in the fabric of those universities that people who emerge from them, in a lot of cases, will become entrepreneurs. That's not true for most of our universities. In Belgium and Flanders, we basically set up iMinds to change that. And not within the university, but we work not within the structures of the universities, because that's infeasible in Europe, but we work closely with the universities and with the students to coach them to become more entrepreneurial minded. And we have startup garages, then a kind of support scheme for people who want to build on work on a project during their studies, etc., etc. We also have an incubation program. And there, for those of you who know the sector, it's a Y Combinator-like program where you basically support companies in the very early stage with money to get a proof of market and to get to a stage where they can potentially apply for financing. And the key to the success is, I think, our entrepreneur in residence concept, where we actually match the students or researchers or technologists with people with seasoned experience in product marketing, good business development, international sales, etc., finance, in order to actually create business plans that are viable and translate good ideas into companies and to markets. Yeah. This program, we started it a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, and we've really been running it full speed last year. And my goal was last year, we almost got there, was the last 4 quarters to get 100 good registrations in, but really quality, people applying, applicants in, and then select about 20 from those on a yearly basis. This year we will probably go to 30 and next year 14. That's what I mean with critical mass. You need to get some kind of critical mass going and numbers of ideas, a number of people involved, because not everybody will make it, and you create in that a knowledge base, so to speak. That iStart program is, we see now that a number of companies from that program are moving on into other support programs we have, but also into follow-up financing. Yeah. And I want to come back to the international scope. If I hear people, like yesterday, I was set up with a number of people, maybe some of you are in the audience, but some people who have companies here and who came to present, to pitch their ideas. Yeah? And it was striking to me how variable, so to speak, the pitches were. I'm not saying they were good or bad, but how different. Some of them were very technology driven. You know, we have this great technology. Some of them were very salesy, like we're the best in the world, you know, which you should never say to certainly a venture capitalist, or we're unique, because, you know, you're never unique. And some of them were kind of like too modest. Yeah? And I've seen the same phenomenon in Belgium. Yeah? We are not, by definition, culturally inclined to sell ourselves very well in Europe, except for the Dutch. They're very good at it. Yeah? I'm not sure if there's Dutch here, but for sure the Dutch are, most of the time, pretty good at it. But for the rest, if you talk to a Finnish guy, and I think based on my experience yesterday, also a Polish person, a guy or girl, and Belgians, they're not very good at selling themselves. So we, for example, now send our companies, if they want to, after they also have to apply and have to be selected, to California for 3 months to get immersed in the culture there. So to know how, not only to sell yourself, but to know what game you're playing, with who you are competing, how the other companies are positioning themselves. Because you're never alone in this market. You're always competing globally. And this is both true going to the States or going east. Those cultures you have to adapt to as well. So we have both programs. But most importantly, I think the Go West program helps our portfolio of startups, and those are the startups in different fields that we actually generated in last year, helps them really becoming more competitive in the global world. So if you look at the 2012 track record, which we are ramping up, we basically created 12 of those companies. A number of them have received follow-up financing. And I'm just going to give you one example, because you know, you probably think, okay, what kind of companies are there? They're in very different fields. So let me just go back. It could be media, could be in manufacturing, IT. It could be more basic information technology, or in healthcare, for example. But for example, this company, just to give you an idea of what can happen, they're a tablet application for restaurant point of sales. Now, they're good people, and I met people who did iPad development yesterday here from Poland who are building great stuff as well, but they don't have a product idea yet. They're just in the project phase. But these people, if we wouldn't have had our programs, they would never be where they are now. They went into the Go West, into our incubation program, then into that Go West program. They signed a deal in Las Vegas with Griffin Technology. They have actually penetrated the US market now, which is much more receptive for this kind of technology than Europe in most cases. And they've gone very quickly, which is necessary in this market. You don't have time to waste. You really need to move and go from your idea to your product, first initial market verification in a couple of months. And those kind of companies, I really believe, although this is not artificial intelligence, this is basic stuff, but it is something that's really useful for the companies that are adopting it right now. Sorry. Those kind of companies are helped through our program to become global quite much faster. Now, I want to end with one thing that I think most of you who are eventually going to go pursue a company will run into, and that's the financing issue. Venture capital in Europe is extremely hard to get. You saw the number of Germany, 250 million, I believe it was, for the whole of Germany in 1 year. The good news for Berlin was that half of it was Berlin, but the bad news is that it's only 250 million. Compare that to the gross national product of that country and to the money. I mean, they're putting 250 million in one bridge, in some countries, or in 10 football stadiums, right? Or 5. So 250 million is peanuts. So there is a problem with venture capital in Europe, and this chart gives you why. And I believe personally that venture capital in Europe is not well structured and doesn't have the right people, and that's the reason it's not profitable. But early stage venture capital in Europe, as opposed to the States, has been giving negative returns. That's why we don't have any money, as startups, because companies or venture capitalists are not profitable, so they don't get investors to invest in them in Europe. So I think really what needs to change fundamentally is the financing environment here. And for example, if you look at the startups of iMinds of last year, we were able to get 5 times the capital we put in there from other investors, but that's not enough. So what I'm working on right now, primarily, is trying to find funding sources for the startups that I believe that are really valuable and have growth potential, and do that on a global basis. And I think there is hope, and that's what I want to end with, because there are forces disrupting the venture capital world. Yeah? First, it was mentioned before, we have things like Amazon and other technologies that allow you to start cheap. You don't need a lot of capital to start. Secondly, also in Europe, you have angel investors, and this is actually not something I invented, it's out of TechCrunch, but I want to make the point, because I do believe, when I read the article, it really mirrored my views. The second thing is you have a lot of serial entrepreneurs, people like myself. I'm a business angel now in companies, because I think you can make money with it, but also because I like the sector and I like the dynamics of startups. You have new technologies on the internet like Kickstarter for crowdfunding, AngelList for business angel funding. There's the incubators. And there are new venture firms that are much more helping companies and creating companies than just sitting back and providing money. The only thing we are missing, well, we don't have all those things, but they're emerging in Europe as well. The only thing we're still missing is a good secondary market, liquidity, exits, etc. And that'll probably have to come also from much closer integration with the US. So we're also reaching out to US investors for a lot of our startups. So to wrap it up, based on my personal experience and what I see now with the companies that we're coaching, we're trying to build, I think there are a number of elements that we all need to put into place throughout Europe in the different regions It's not unachievable, but it's also not easy. You have to really work on all those factors, and you have to take into account that when one of those is missing, you have to really reach out. And it would be too easy to say, well, we all move to Berlin or to London and we create it there. That's not the reality of Europe. The reality of Europe is we will always be relatively dispersed, and there will be pockets of excellence everywhere. But you have to think really well then about how you are going to position. And if somebody comes to me from our portfolio and says, okay, I want to move to the US, I think it's better for us there, I think it's a good thing, you know. At some point in time, somebody from that company will come back and start another company, and we'll exchange know-how and people, etc. So we'll have to deal with that global world. So probably some of you will move somewhere else, but others will build their companies here. And I wish you all the best of luck in doing so. Thank you.